I'm somewhat keenly aware of the thin thread of coherence in sort of all of my let's say discourse over these models and how I'm trying to speculatively extend them and explore them. Um, I do think that there is a lot of sort of agreement between what I've said if that picture can start to be sort of um, come together. I've yeah, I mean, obviously, I you know, thinking back on what I've put down in these voice recordings, I get a little bit self-conscious that, some of it is just so potentially self-contradictory and sparse, but I think that there is a thread of cohesion there, but it is quite thin, and it is anyway. I see that it is rounding towards some kind of overarching cohesion. I was just thinking laterally today that, and I was exploring this when I was talking about borderline, and I sort of talking about the topic of sexuality, um, and I do think that there is something like that intimacy or certain forms of intimacy are essentially connotate uh, one's control over the devotion, the content of the devotion. That the sort of recasting or reimagining that relay between the ego parent function and the superego inferior function, which is the base of the subconscious, the base of your sense of the core of for your sense of be. Uh, and so it's interesting because I think that the devotion might also connotate, how sort of marriage is described, even in Genesis in the scriptures, that when Genesis is being told, it says, and then that is why a man and a woman will, I can't remember the exact phrase, I think it's cleave together and become one flesh. I think that there is a there is a mingling of that kind of devotion there, and then I also talked about sort of the healing that can occur through a kind of sexual energy through sort of, I think it all has to do with the devotion essentially, because the devotion is right, it's very close to sort of the uh, sort of, it's not close to the source of the false ego complex as an entity, but it's close to the beginning structure of the metagram circuitry in the false ego complex. So it's mechanistically right at the basement foundation floor of the actual, of the structure that you spend most of your time sort of within the ambit thereof, and beholden to. And so it's sort of, it is the most sort of, anyway, it's very significant in that sense, because it's sort of, this is what determines, it's the part or the free agency you have in your sense of have within the parent function of the ego, and how it impresses itself on the core or the base of your sense of be, uh, which is in also the inferior function of the superego, is where the devotion is happening, where the parent function is imprinting itself or tracing itself within. It's the parent function of the ego is tracing itself in the superego inferior function, which is then serving as the base or the core of the subconscious. Anyway, so it is working around, skirting around outside the domain of the superego. So it only has the space left for it, sort of the no man's land demarcated by the superego parent that it's left over. But anyway, so the superego is this kind of hidden force that this is happening behind the back of the superego. And in some sense, it's happening in the part of the superego that has been relinquished, or has been sort of, that is a kind of anathema to the superego. Anyway, what's the point here? So, if you can reimagine the devotion, you are relitigating the development of your parent function in your ego, which I believe is the first thing that is developed. It's the first moving part within the false ego complex, and in some sense the first thing it has to do is it has to lead its base, which means it has to perform an oath, and that oath in some sense already has to have a model of the whole functioning false ego complex. The oath has to have a kind of prescription that it's importing from the superego. So the oath has to know its true origin story, that it's in some sense replicating or mimicking some structure that has already happened within the superego, and it uses that to pre-plan, kind of predestination of what its overarching image and structure will be. So the oath already presupposes what the content of the devotion will be based on an ideal image of how the whole false ego complex already would be in operation. So the oath has to presuppose a devotion. And in some sense it has to, I think it basically is modeling that from the ego's own sin, which is the superego's base. And so the oath is already indulging in the ego's own sin. It knows that it's already, what it's doing is folly. What it's doing is fundamentally, it's going to be making a child function. It's going to be treating its own, the parent function in the ego is treating its own base of that local side of the mind as if its child function is already lost, is already not capable of being executed. So its oath at the ground floor already knows that its own child function is being dishonored or disowned. The oath knows that it is already in sin, but it is in some sense enslaved to replicate what's happening in the superego. It's fundamentally in league with the beast in the superego, which is the ego's sin, which is the base of the superego. So it's just replicating that in some sense. And that's going over the head of the inferior function in the ego, which is obviously the no man's land for the ego. So the inferior function in the ego is the only thing that actually knows the truth of this sordid transaction. And the inferior function ends up being manipulated to some degree by the unconscious parent function, which is performing the question, which is somewhat covering, is the mystery that's covering this sordid exchange that's happening betwixt, it's literally happening, that this inferior function is, in the ego, is sort of the strange reservoir of reality and sanity that has to sort of lead itself into a mirage, which is the delusion, which is the habitual pattern in some sense. It's the bystander that perhaps is maybe this bystander is incapable of doing anything. And this is the reservoir of consciousness this is the most immediate, when people actually have the voice in your head that can talk how you direct it to think. That is the inferior function in the ego. I think that is the only free voice there is in the entire structure. anyway, and I think that in some sense you have to try to get that voice to be in league with other voices. Perhaps, or you have to just even try to, I don't know, maybe it is the dominant function in the superego which has to be emulated by that inferior function, and that is how the the fire of freedom, the torch of freedom, is passed on into the resurrection or the rehabilitation of the superego dominant function, which can then change the character of all these structures uh, as the true first cause and the first base, because the dominant function, a rogue dominant function in the superego, can then perhaps recapture and encapsulate the parent function in the superego, and then you've got all the ingredients to begin a new personality, but anyway, or a reborn structure, psychological schema. But anyway, I was talking first. Okay, now I was talking about therapy, but let me go back to what I was talking about before. So I think that what borderlines are doing, and what sexuality is to some degree, is the oath itself knows that it's a kind of mimicry of what the superego parent function has done to the sin of the ego, which is the core of the superego, the beast. And in some sense, maybe the oath, when it was starting this modeling, this replication, right at the beginning, it is aware that, well, it's mimicking something that is posited, but there's nothing automatic about its replication. It's actually consciously enslaving itself to replicate this image. But it could perhaps hypothetically think, well, the image could be different. The image could be a different image that I'm mimicking. Perhaps I could put I could replicate something that's in a different project, in a different statement, in a different constitution. I could have a different constitution to the one that I'm currently mimicking. So that fundamental awareness is I mean, perhaps the beast itself could even have that as part of its character, as a self-critical. Anyway, a self that it could be part of it could include a self-critical faculty. But anyway, I actually wanted to say something completely different. I wanted to say that essentially that the beast itself is mimicked by the ego parent function, but that imagine that the parent function in the superego is in the business, or is to produce a different edict of leadership over its own base. That it's actually capable of having a different attitude. That it's not, that how it treats its own base is not a fixed structure. It's a chain. It's something that's capable of modulating or changing. Now, this is what I think borderlines are doing. I think borderlines are actually changing their superego death, or their superego beast, or core, and then their parent function in their ego is immediately mirroring that change in disposition. And so every time their oath is got a radically divergent devotion. So that it's like, I mean, there's almost an analogy in this in identity politics. Sort of, it's like fluidly changing your sexual preference just because of, oh well, I'm a mystery inside, or something like that. That my ego is mystified by my superego's arbitrary election. That its very nature its very identity is an arbitrary election. And that whole attitude is going to have a certain signature over its own ego function, child and dominant function, that they're going to be expendable hostages to be recapitulated every time, and every time you need to replace your hostages, you just scapegoat and say, well, my environment, the reason why I had to destroy these hostages and get new ones is because you weren't treating me with the requisite amount of respect. You weren't acquiescing to my demand, so I had to prove that I was serious and expunge these hostages. So, uh, anyway, so they're going to have very uh, brittle, capricious, loud, juvenile, unintegrated child and dominant function in their ego. Whereas most people will have a very well developed dominant function in their ego, because the child function in their ego will always be sensitive, because it starts off in a handicap position, essentially. And the dominant function has to grow sophisticated enough to disguise and to what's the word, to sort of to facilitate a kind of, I can't think of the word, so I'll just describe it like, to put in safety rails in order to disguise, in order to limit the dynamism of the child function, so that it doesn't sort of very obviously um, expose itself uh, as being functionally we just say despairing. Uh, okay. So, what's my point here? Is that the idea that the oath can be different is probably something that, at least hypothetically, the ego is capable of entertaining. Uh, as a kind of hypothetical thought experiment, or something like that. And I'll just say that is reminiscent of outlining structures in the superego, because it's reminiscent of the primordial relationship between the ego and the superego. And so I think that sort of toying with a devotion, or toying with hypothetical different devotions, is a way of testing from the outside, from the ego's relay to the subconscious base, a way of outlining the structures that might exist in the superego. So, anyway, And so you're treading on things, or you're treading around things that are very primordial to, your own very early development in your own ego. So, I do think sexuality and intimacy is very much connected with the devotion. And also healing, therefore, as well. And, it's interesting that the description of the church and the communion is, the body of Christ, the flesh of Christ, the members in particular are the body of Christ, a single flesh. And it also, the descriptions of the church, the sacred secret and all those sorts of things that are spoken about, which are very sort of hermetical, alchemical descriptions of union, of marriage, even. Anyway, that's just why I brought up. I just wanted to retouch on the themes that I already mentioned in terms of, you know, sexuality and the healing around that theme in this context. Also, what might be worth mentioning is that I think that Concord was a Concordia, and the priests of Concord, or the priestesses of Concord, were it was a very interesting cult, and the kind of the it's very hard to I know that very little is, at least, is sort of the Greek and Roman temple structures and rites and magic and things like that. But it's let me just. I mean, I would say that both Eros and Harmonia, or Concord and Discordia, or Concordia and Discordia, are both related to this devotion. And I do think that, if you just look at how borderlines, I think, manage their kind of social manipulation, it's a kind of discordant magic. It's a magic of discordance. That is how, and you can almost see it within society. These are very deep themes that have to do with group narcissism and sort of collective madness and sort of collective delusion that is made out of out groups and in groups, and being in discord with the orthodoxy and setting up orthodoxies that are and it's very interesting, because if you just look at Homer's description of Eros, I think there are even two descriptions of discord itself. That there's a generative discord, which is almost like the precursor towards a greater synthesis, and then there's just a kind of a malevolent discord that is just sort of self-gratifying and not capable of being integrated into a common or negotiated or um, anyway, I guess I don't want to talk about that anymore. Probably want to make a recording on pure politics. That's what I seem to be moved to talk about. But I think that essentially, yeah, just going back to self-actualization or therapy, that seems to me that the final step is essentially to dissolve the beast. Uh, in the lake of fire, which is probably the child function, in the superego, sort of in some kind of pure or purified um, uh, it's almost an abyss itself. Uh, or I guess I should not use such cryptic language. It's almost, I think it's hard to conceptualize or to have a vision of the child function in the superego because you can only sort of do it in the abstract. It's like you can't look at it. You can't pin it down because to instantiate the child function, the superego, on any particular subject or issue makes the whole structure of the false ego complex. It sort of makes the whole thing moot. It makes the whole thing. I can't think of the correct word, but it outweighs the value of the of anything in the false ego complex. And so it has this ability to sort of to extinguish, but it does so in such a total way, in such an overarching way that it's not it only works if you can sort of take the whole structure and dissolve it all at once, which means that you have to probably take the right structure and put it inside of there. And I think that, I wonder if that structure is I wonder, maybe it's not the beast, maybe it is the parent function itself that needs to be placed inside of it. I mean, that is the false prophet. So maybe it's those two things that have to be reconciled, and then it's interesting. In the scriptures, it describes that the beast, I mean, it does, I think at some earlier point, talk about the beast and the false prophet going into the lake of fire, I think. I know it's more than just the false prophet, but it explicitly talks about the false prophet being placed in the lake of fire. I think it also explicitly says the beast. But it also, at another point at least, it uses the word perdition. But I think the beast is described as being consumed by fire out of heaven as it comes to make war against the New Jerusalem, the holy city. So it's that, perhaps. I mean, if you put the false prophet in the lake of fire first, essentially all you would be doing is you would have to find the motivational arc characterizing the parent function in the superego, which would essentially be the seed that is confounding and setting the image of the beast in terms of how the superego is relating to its base. And then you would essentially have to, I guess, to put that in the lake of fire, you would have to have an alternative motivational structure that is antithetical to that, but it might have to be brought. I mean, I don't think the lake of fire is just the inverse of the structure of your false ego complex. It has to be more robust than that. It has to be more all-encompassing. It has to be a general formula of fault or a general formula of error. It has to be a systematic invalidation of incorrectness on the dimension that corresponds with the child function in the superego. That would have to be what the lake of fire is, which I'm not even sure if that can be. I think that can only be properly ascertained by the conjunction of the child function and the dominant function. You would have to get leadership of the dominant function and the superego in order to do that, because the formula of just because you wouldn't have to then know a dogma, you would just have to know the stylistic functionality of the dominant function, and then essentially everything that violates or is incongruent with the style of functioning of the dominant function. So that's the kind of the scaffolding of the lake of fire. But is that not perhaps? So you have to worry that maybe is not what I'm describing. I mean, what I'm describing might actually be how the knowledge of good and evil is already orchestrated in service of the beast, in service of the imprint. Or I guess what would make it not a knowledge of good and evil is that the dominant function is not defined as a dogma. It's defined as just its fluid operation, its organic living. The New Jerusalem is at great pains to describe itself as being a city of glass roads, and of living trees all over the place with thousands of fruit, and sort of 12 varieties, and 12 gates made out of pearls. So these 12 gates, anyway, in the dominant function, so perhaps it's sort of how the dominant function works in relation to the 12 component elements of anyway, I don't want to talk about that, but anyway, so if you just have a general structure of how the dominant function, of how things work within the dominant function's paradigm, then maybe that is enough to give you a picture of the lake of fire. And then can you use that essentially to cleanse the parent function and have that operate as then the tree of life? So perhaps that is the real work of the rehabilitation, is all within the superego, the child function, the dominant function, and the parent function. And then I did just want to also raise again that and it would be interesting to read back and to recalibrate and make sure. I mean, I had settled on before that the dominant function, that the parent function in the superego is the first church that is being spoken of right at the beginning of the book of Revelations, and then the inferior function of the superego, which is the base of the subconscious, is the second church. The child function of the subconscious is the third church. The dominant function of the subconscious is the fourth church. The parent function of the subconscious is the fifth church. The inferior function of the subconscious is the sixth church. And the sin of the subconscious, which is also the child function of the unconscious, is the seventh church. And by the way, the sixth church that I mentioned is also obviously the base of the unconscious. Which is why I believe that when the sixth church is mentioned, it talks about something resolving 10 days from then. Because if you take from the sixth church and you, which is the beginning therefore of the unconscious side of the mind, you go 10 including itself. So if itself is 1, if the next day is 2, and the third day is 3, and you count up to 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you go from the base of the unconscious to the sin of the ego is 10 things. And then you have spanned the rest of the sides of the mind, essentially. Because it says, anyway, I think I'm correct. Or maybe it's the fifth church that says something special about 10 days from then. But yeah, I mean, that's the horrible thing with my thing, is I could probably make anything fit. So it would just then refer to something else and the emphasis would shift. So not that helpful. But yeah, so I must say I'm recounting this off the top of my head, so I might even be incorrect. Yeah, so making these, but anyway, it might be useful perhaps to then see if the first church could not be overlaid on, instead of saying that the first church is the dominant is the parent function in the superego, maybe the first church, I should try to take that as the child function of the superego, since I'm saying that that's the most important thing, and see how it would line up then, and to remake the correspondences and see if I can get more descriptive work out of the explanation of the first 7 churches. But I've always taken the first 7 churches to be, in some sense, of vital importance, but not that important. It's like it's necessary for the beginning work of awareness of what's going on. That because in some sense, between the first church and the sixth church, if I'm correct in my first overlay, the first church and the sixth church is essentially the superego parent function priming the subconscious inferior function, in which I call the answer. So the parent function, the superego, is performing within the theater of the sixth church, which is essentially anyway, this is basically very important work, because that is the beginning of the circuit that, from the most obtuse way of recounting that circuit, the long way round, it is essentially showing you the core of your free mind, because the inferior function in the ego is connected to the parent function in the unconscious, which is connected to um, which is leading, obviously, the base of the unconscious, which is being primed, which that base of that unconscious is if my overlay is correct, is the sixth church, which is being primed by the first church, which the superego parent function. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about on this topic. I just wanted to mention all those things. This is an addendum to the psychological piece that I recorded earlier. This is kind of wild speculation and just thinking out loud, but I think I've had a profound thought that I want to record on this topic. So, thinking about the lake of fire, I think that I have, in the formulation that I tried to speculate around being an awareness of the lake of fire, or finding a way to outline that structure which is within the superego child function. I still believe that that is correct, that it is in the superego child function, but I think how I set that up, or in terms of how it might, I mean, obviously those themes are very important and there's something to what I said, but that I think that what I said is essentially wrong. You can't sort of set up a positive, in some sense. I think when I was trying to emulate a formulation that I constructed earlier, to try to construct a lake of fire, or to be in awareness of the lake of fire, I think what I'm running up against is actually what is described in Genesis, the sword that turns every way, that keeps the way of the tree of life. I think that if you, because essentially you can't, you have to, in some sense, the problem is that I think that this is just a non-starter, that the lake of fire is related to this topic, but I haven't found the way to access it or to make use of it, because it's appearing as the sword that turns every way, because I'm obviously trying to probably emulate it maybe from the ego inferior, and it can't be. It has to, in some sense, this is problematic, because maybe if the lake of fire is the same thing as the sword that turns every way, in some sense, the problem with the sword that turns every way is that it can't be wielded. You can't use it. You can't make use of it. And it's too mysterious to actually to be in a consistent relatedness to it. To say, oh, the lake of fire is over there, and the false prophet has been placed in it, and the beast has been placed in it. Can't do that, because it's not a lake of fire, it's a sword that turns every way. So I can't extrapolate from the sword that turns every way into the lake of fire, because it exists within the superego context of the doing. It only is in what you are doing, so you can't have judgment of it and see it. You'd have to translate it into ego structure terms, and essentially the inferior function in the ego can't stably contain this. Actually, it would be interesting. Maybe the dominant function in the ego might be able to. That would. Yeah, that's the problem. Is that even if it could, actually, that doesn't help, because what you really want is you want liberation of the inferior function in the ego. So that's the fundamental problem, I think. Which is archetypally, I mean, the inferior function in the ego, I think, is archetypally the thing that is essentially is the work of the crucifixion. Sort of pertains to that is the word, the container that casts meaning and stuff. But that I do think that also the only begotten Son is essentially the doctrinal code that allows you to then merge with the sin of the ego, because the sin of the ego is essentially, it's a judgment that you have, and in some sense it pertains as much to the world as it pertains to you, or because your ego is in the world. Anyway, so the only way is you. Well, I mean, this is one of the steps to getting to the lake of fire, is you have to have a bridge between the inferior function and the sin, or the inferior function and the base of the superego, which is the sin of the ego. That has to be amalgamated, and that is like the work of the crucifixion. Because just if people don't know, vicarious redemption is not in the doctrine of Christ. There is, it is very clearly excludes vicarious redemption. You are expected to enjoin the work of the crucifixion. Corinthians, it says, I die daily. But also explicitly around the crucifixion, pick up your cross and follow. But also, I'll just make some other points as well. I actually think that the doctrine of Christ is better explained and understood to not entail divine revelation. This is an important point. I think that this is actually a core tenet of the doctrine. This is the point that Jesus is making all the time when he says, you will, if you take the testimony of men, but you won't take the testimony that I'm the Son of God. He's not saying believe me because of divine revelation. He's saying understand what I'm saying. So in some sense, this is almost a meta point that I think Jesus is drawing from this, which is that it's not, you don't believe him on the basis of divine revelation, you believe him on the basis of divine evaluation, that you evaluate the truth. That is exactly what is being described in 1 John chapter 4, that you can hear the Spirit of God. And the thing that allows you to hear the Spirit of God is that you have the same Spirit, essentially. That there is one Spirit of truth, and we connect with each other. This is also explicitly in 1 John chapter 4. The life is in the believe on the name of the only begotten Son. Anyway, so this is the construction of Christ consciousness, essentially, which I think is explicitly in the scripture. If you actually read the King James Version of 1 John chapter 4, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, for many false prophets are gone out unto the world. Hereby ye know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Hereby ye know ye the spirit of God. Whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. Anyway, whereof ye have heard that it should come. Oh, sorry, I didn't. It actually says, oh, sorry. I skipped out too many things. All those who confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God, and all those who confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And here is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. So if you believe that Jesus Christ should come, then you're an Antichrist. And to be of the Spirit of God, you have to confess that Jesus Christ is come. It says confess. It doesn't say believe that he is come. It says confess that he is come. You can't confess, then you get these really weird people who try to sophisticate and create this disgusting article of faith out of semantic bullshit. It says that you must confess that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. You can't confess something that happened 2,000 years ago that you didn't witness. You can't confess that. You didn't witness it. It doesn't say that you believe that he did come. It doesn't even use the past tense. It says, confess that Jesus Christ is come. Present tense. And if you do not confess that he is come, then you are not of God. It's all present tense. So you have to confess that he is come, not that he did come or that he has came. It's not past tense. The language in the King James is very clear. It's not past tense. It's all present tense. So how can you confess that Jesus Christ is come? There's only one way that you can confess that, is that it's in your flesh. That's the only way that you can confess that it is come, is because what is Jesus Christ is the actual question. And 1 John chapter 5 is very clear about that, essentially. That the life of the only begotten Son, that is the life that we have in that belief on the name. Believe on the name. Not in a person, on the name. Now, this is not a magic spell. Jesus Christ is not a magic spell. It's made up of words that actually have Yeshua Christ. Yeshua is this is how the Hebrew thing comes together. Yeshua means Jehovah saves, means the tetragrammaton. I am that I am saves. That is the name of God. I am that I am saves, and Christ literally means the anointed, or the anointed of God. So literally Jesus Christ literally means, in terms of the actual delineation of what the composite words mean, it means Jehovah God saves the anointed of God. That's what it means. That's what Jesus Christ means. And what is anointed of God? It's basically a teaching. And the teaching is, I mean, to condense it, love your neighbor as you love yourself, and God above all. And, sort of hearing the Spirit. So maybe that can be the kernel. I mean, that is, in some sense, the kernel also of the Spirit of the Lord, that magnifies the Lord, that there is some hope towards that teleos. That duty of love in service of that teaching is also the form of self-love that is that sort of redounds back into a positive value that is exercised. So maybe that can be the lake of fire. Within the context of the function that corresponds to the superego child function. Imagine that teaching that I just said is coming from the dominant function, which then holds a lot of structure within itself that is quite multifaceted and contains many different trees and thousands of fruits and things like that, and glass roads and things like that. That's quite an all-encompassing structure. And based on that structure, then you have a very clearly, in some sense, it's almost like the moat, or at least there's a rubbish pit outside the gates of the New Jerusalem, which sort of has a section of a which is the lake of fire essentially. Anyway, but yeah, in some sense, I don't think that you would use that power that wouldn't be a continual thing that you would have to use to blot up and absorb the darkness or the abyssal forces of the structure of the false ego complex. Then in some sense, it's interesting because in the description of the seven churches right at the beginning of Revelations, it talks about actually it talks about it a few times, but it also, I think, later on in Revelations it talks about an angel casting a millstone into a body of water. And I think that millstone might be related. Actually, I don't think it's even. I think in the seven churches they speak of a millstone, but later on in the Revelations it just talks about a stone being cast. Anyway, it's in a few places in Revelations, an angel throwing a stone, and the talk of a stone that has the name on it. In a few of the churches, I think it might even be 3 of the 7 churches, there is it's interesting because I mean this has also, I think, been thematically linked in some alchemical readings of Revelation already. The talk of the stone has been linked to the philosopher's stone, which is, it's an interesting thing because the philosopher's stone is not is part of a process. It's not part of the new life. It's almost like a catalyst. It's a procedure. Like the lake of fire is a procedural step and an element in a recipe that then, after you follow the recipe, you have the finished product. You have the baked good, and you don't. The recipe is not a continual thing that needs to be constantly cooking. Anyway, so that is my explanation as to why the stone seemingly gets disposed of. But it's interesting how it gets disposed of. I think in some description it's mentioned in the 7 churches, and it's also, I think, brought up again later on. Okay. So I think I covered some interesting topics there. And by the way, I think that also it's interesting that thematically, I think that the hellfire itself is also connected with the child function in the superego, because I believe that essentially the child function in the superego can also be used as a thematic. It is, in some sense, when someone is functioning under the umbrella of the false ego complex, and this is almost too much of a broad brush with which to paint someone, that it's not worth doing so, because it's not helpful. But I think that the child function in the superego is fundamentally problematic. It is, in some sense, problematic. It is the most profanely adulterated function, in some sense, in that it is being, I think that seemingly it would be fabricated. It might even be, if I were to make extractions from my model of the false ego complex and start to make my own sort of 4 sides of the mind map, or sort of summary of someone's characteristics, I think that the demon function, I think you could call the child function of the superego, you could call that the demon function, I think. Or, I mean, it's a bit hard to say because I don't know. Actually, this is embarrassing. I can't remember if what all the names. I mean, of the I don't even. But all the names of the components of the superego are listed as. I think the inferior function of the superego is called the demon, and the dominant function, man, I can't remember them. maybe I actually have I have it wrong. Maybe it's the dominant function that's called the demon. Man, that's embarrassing. I can't remember. Well, you see, this is I did know it at some point, and I could even talk very intelligently about the four sides of the mind at some point. But I get so incepted into my own models, which are so much more detailed and intricate and sophisticated, that it's obviously hard for me to keep track of these other systems that are so simplistic and not so dimensional. Because I mean the anyway, I don't even want to say bad things about the four sides of the mind theory, but basically it's just so fundamentally sort of inaccurate that it has to invent. Yes, people might say, well, I'm the pot calling the kettle black, but I mean, I understand that it can easily sound like I'm just a crackpot smoking something and making stuff up, and it just sounds like it has some semblance of potential cohesion, but it's just sort of rantings and ravings and crackpots diatribes. But I mean, the only thing that would save me is that, well, if I have these 17 metatypes, I have incredibly detailed models, and let's say descriptions of 17 distinct metatypes, and then layers of sophistication on top of that of further specificity and subtypes, that that these archetypes are just so much richer, so much more specific, um, that the structure of them and the detail and the density of it's sort of, I mean, perhaps this is premature for me to say, because all I can do is look at the model of my own metatype, and it's such a perfect description of all the different four sides of the mind, uh, in all of its complexity. It's a perfect phenomenological footprint. And anyway, I mean, if it can do that for anyone else, or I guess it has to be able to do that for everyone else for it to be, then it is essentially the solution to psychology. I mean, it is a proper map of psychology and or at least personality, or a model of cognitive behavior, or whatever. Um, Model of cognitive behavior and personality structure. Anyway, I'm just saying things. I wish I had made the point that I started off talking at the beginning of this recording. I wish I made that point a bit stronger. I'll try to fill that in now. I was going to say, just because it might be an interesting sort of context, um, for thinking about this problem and finding similar workaround or solutions, or just to get the speculative arena fully primed with what I can see about it. Is that the child function of the superego? Child function of the superego. Oh, I didn't finish the last point I was making, although it's thematically is kind of linked. Um, that the child function of the superego is profane because it's always being performed, and it always has some kind of pretense or some kind of ostensible claim that it's making, but it never has a stable substantiation behind its kind of its gist, its motivational gist, and so it's kind of like a, but it is being calibrated within itself. Thematic. I mean, obviously, it's hard to say this within about anything in the superego, because the superego is such a kind of implicit thing that is happening. Um, that is sort of happening simultaneously with all the other three sides of the mind functioning relative to the superego as a kind of as a holistic sort of dipole, or like in some sense that the superego is like the electric field, and then the other three sides of the mind are combined the commensurate magnetic field that is being sympathetically induced, or vice versa. You could say that the metagram circuitry, or the other three sides of the mind, the other relays are the electric circuitry that is being induced by the superego's magnetism. Um, and both of those perspectives, and in some sense, each of them internally does see itself as electric, and the other one is magnetic. And in some sense, I think that the thing that is actually burdening that contradiction, or that paradox rather, is the oath. The oath is fundamentally kind of involuting itself in its own paradox, which is in some sense what makes the parent function and the ego a very important primordial link in the chain of the development of the false ego complex. That it has an ontological predominance, but the subconscious base, which is technically set up by the parent function, is primed by the parent function and the ego. So I think that the first devotion that the oath is paradoxically anticipating is a kind of is an inverse devotion. That the oath has, I mean, this is just helping me get my semantics straight. I've described this before, but now I think that, so basically the oath has an inverse devotion as one of its sandwiched layers of paradox in its terms of its initial leadership over the ego's establishment of its own base. That because when the oath happens without a functioning metagram relay system, when it's happening for the first time, it has to believe that the devotion has already happened, even though it hasn't. So it kind of has an inverted devotion built within the first oath. And that inverted devotion then gets retroactively retconned as the question, as the unconscious parent function priming the inferior function in the ego. Or maybe there is a kind of commingling, maybe there is a kind of osmotic osmosis between the base of the ego, which is the inferior function of the unconscious, and the unconscious parent function, which is right on the border with its inferior function, is because its inferior function is activating then that parent function in the unconscious is being sympathetically, it's sort of the activity that's happening in the inferior function is perhaps also because of the inverse devotion that is part of the oath, that inverse devotion is rubbing off by osmosis and charging up the unconscious parent function. So the unconscious parent function is organically producing a question that is a reflection of this inverse devotion. So the inverse devotion, which is inculcated within the oath. So the parent function in the ego, which is performing this oath that has an inverse devotion in it, is already setting up its own inferior function via the kind of osmosis, shadow casted sort of ether. The inverse devotion has a kind of correlating influence that escapes. It's kind of like anyway. And that could also perhaps be like a kind of yin and yang thing as well, that the oath from the parent function with its inverse devotion and I think that sort of the inculcation of an inverse devotion is a kind of is what we generally associate perhaps with the female gender, perhaps, and the devotion itself, like not an oath that has an inverse devotion put into it, but an oath, a devotion that is forthright and active and plain and blunt and expressive of itself, not that is direct, is seen as so the thing that is actually priming an inferior function is itself, to prime an inferior function, I think has a kind of male gender, or at least alchemically or symbolically, or how gender is symbolically cast. I think that those are the two sort of feminine, the two gender properties. Anyway, that's a tangent. Is there anything important for me to say? Yeah, so I mean, the more I stare at this and look at this, I think the more I'm uncovering and piecing it all together. Everything I've just said, though, is not necessarily that useful for self-actualization or real therapy, because in some sense that gives you some insights perhaps into, or an overview into, the convolution of the positively developed false ego complex in terms of the three sides of the mind that in some sense probably, but in some sense that doesn't even get into what is the magic of the crucifixion in terms of the inferior function combining with the sin, because in some sense the sin is being generated from inside the superego, and everything that I just said does not involve the superego. And that is where the healing takes place, is sort of the integration between the ego and the superego, which is happening through the inferior function, which is already sort of 3 steps down the river. It is sort of down the chain of events, because what I was just talking about was in inverse devotion inculcated within the oath, but also how the oath, with its inverse devotion, is inculcating a particular question that then is being cast by the unconscious parent function, which is, I think probably correctly named in the Four Sides of the Mind, well, as the dominant function is called the nemesis, and the parent function is called the critic, and in some sense the critic is often one of the most active elements of the unconscious side of the mind. And so I think that what I've just laid down goes along with all of that quite nicely, especially with my general view of what dominant functions and child functions, how they relate to their local sides of the mind. But yeah, anyway, how they generally generate supporting automatic sophistication that corroborates the basic tendency, or the most basic tendency, that the parent function is engaged in, at least in conjunction with how it relates to its own base, or the core of that local side of the mind. Anyway, I think I've made some real cohesive progress in getting all these things nicely tied together. This is an addendum to the psychology that I was talking about, and this is slightly speculative. So I've been thinking about that even if you have complete control and properly integrated superego, when I say complete control, I mean you've got sort of the root, the core structure of your false ego complex under heel, sort of restructured. I guess a lingering issue that I'm thinking about is that, well, you still have metagram circuitry that then is doing something else, or that is more agile or more free to be fluid and organic and responsive, that your range of responsibility, the actual structure of your metatype, is still functionally there. It just has it has oversight over itself. It knows thyself, and therefore it can be spiritually discerning. And in some sense, then what is left then is that the devotion itself becomes like a kind of community, or it becomes some kind of function of communication. So devotion is kind of like, is the act of communion or something like that, and which is, to put it in secular terms or whatever, I think it's the ability of having a shared game, of sharing a game, of having a concert of purpose, of coordinated, deliberate and there's there's perhaps an innate politics, a spiritual politics about that, which really goes into, that there is always going to be a perpetual distinction between the world and the truth of the spirit, that the little flock, that essentially truth cannot be injected into all arenas, into all, essentially you can't be in communion with someone via an argument. You can't attach to someone and get into the kind of spiritual negotiation. Some people are just literally not capable of doing that. They're so plugged in to their circuitry or whatever. So there's perhaps a politics around that, but this is perhaps a lagging issue related to the woman and the dragon that fly off, so that because a child is going to be born by the woman. And I think that the dragon is essentially the dominant function in the ego, and the woman is the parent function in the unconscious side of the mind. And that I might be slightly wrong about that. Maybe it's something of the inverse or something like that. Maybe the unconscious side of the mind parent is the dragon. Anyway, I think that I think that the unconscious parent is the woman, and in some sense, between those two things, which is in some sense the question, which I've already said is kind of like the inculcated reflection of the oath that has an inverted devotion built into the oath in its fundamental structure and base, which is in some sense the real electric mover, and then magnetically the woman and the dragon have to reach some kind of consortium between themselves in order to provide the, let's say, the epistemological framework that the ego is encapsulated within. So it's sort of the actual, but the ontology actually is set up from the from the parent and the ego, and informing this oath that has an inverted devotion built into it. And in some sense, that inverted devotion is, the ideal image of the false ego complex, which is a reflection of the beast, a reflection of the death, which is essentially slavery to the superego, sort of fundamental fragmentation of the dominant function in the superego, which archetypally I would relate that to Babylon the Great. That is essentially built on the blood of the saints, but which is being fed to the parent function in the ego, which is archetypally the whore of Babylon. So the whore is really the central figure, but the woman and the dragon are kind of like a complete, in consortium with each other. The woman and the dragon are a complete reflection of the whore, or at least the whore's control over her local base, over the death of the ego, which is, of course, the inferior function of the unconscious side of the mind. So you can see that there's this, that the ego is fundamentally premised in the unconscious side of the mind. So these things are kind of like they come as a package. You can't have one without the other anyway. So these things are fundamental reflections of each other. The dominant function in the ego and the unconscious parent function. So the woman and the dragon are capable of essentially creating new personality variants. They're able to propagate different permutations of the metagram circuitry. Now, once the metagram circuitry, let's say, is fundamentally unrooted because the superego is fixed, essentially is integrated with the ego, then perhaps you have a sympathetic restructuring also. You have a new personality that is born. But it's still a separate leg of the integrated superego. It's all integrated, so it's better, it's more agile, it's more fluid. But it still needs to be transcribed from the ego into the unconscious. It still needs an osmosis between the inferior function of the unconscious side of the mind, which is the base of the ego, needs to be translated into what you subjectively do, which is obviously what the unconscious side of the mind is. That's the central, that's what it is the sense of. It is your subjective sense of what you do, which is in some sense now much more lockstep in terms of what you are doing. That these things are perhaps transparent reflections of one another. That perhaps that the dominant function in the superego, which is the New Jerusalem that has these glass roads, are transparently connected with the, let's say, the epistemological substrate beneath it, that you can see through to those things as, let's say, the supporting undergirding grounding of the city is in a particular terrain, as it were. That's a kind of analogy. Anyway, these things are happening under the ground beneath it I'm trying to create an allegory around this. Anyway, so that's interesting, is that, and now this woman and the dragon has to make a new personality. Well, is that new personality not a model of a communion, a model of a church, a moral of a spiritual ethic, of a spiritual culture? or a capability of a kind of spiritual conciliation and harmony in some sense. It is, and which will have a personal personification, a personal representation in terms of the individual style of the person's devotion and how that devotion manifested can cohabitat a spiritual culture that is in some sense in quality the same, that it has that it's the same condition of faith, it's the same condition of understanding, but it's not it's the same quality, but it's not the same content. Essentially, it's a different instantiation. So there is only one begotten Son, but it is a spirit that is essentially shared, and that it can identify that spirit that is the center of the reality that the devotion is involved in referencing itself to. And then you have perhaps the problem of kind of spiritual politics in that, well, how do you deal with that which is fundamentally incongruent? Anyway, some sense, I mean, maybe I think about this because, I made a recording which is essentially a kind of, it's a moral, it's kind of an argument for the moral necessity of allowing for some form of legalized, some window of a legalized abortion, essentially because liberal values need to be institutionalized at some point in principle, so that you can actually have a moral domain in which individuals can, so that you can have some kind of freedom and latitude. Anyway, I mean, I know that is an argument which could be horribly extended, and you could say that, well, it's a fundamentally kind of fudged argument. But I would argue that yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder if it is too much of a fudged argument in a technical way, because basically my whole argument hinges on the fact that there is a technical overlap between the autonomy, the bodily autonomy of a woman, and the right to life of the unborn child. And because there is essentially technically an overlap of those two rights, although you could obviously say that the right to life is more important, is a more important right to protect, that because these two rights do actually intersect, that you should allow for some window. You see, I guess you could just say, well, prevention. The window could be, let's say, abstractly said that you could just, well, the way to choose to have a child is that it's already been acceded to in some kind of, if the sexual act was consensual, then essentially there's an implicit behavior which can be regarded as some kind of tacit knowledge and ergo consent. Because if you know that you might fall pregnant from sexual contact, even though that it's a slight chance, if it happens, then you knew, and therefore there was an iota of essentially of conscious choice and election, and then you're just trying to sort of shirk your own consequences and responsibility for being held accountable for your own behavior. Or the consequences resulting from your own behavior. Obviously, that argument doesn't work in the case of rape, essentially. In which case, the grey area, I think, does become a bit too controversial to have. Certainly becomes controversial to have strict standards. Because if I would call them the grey matter, essentially, that again, and I mean, I do this to stand up for views that I don't personally hold, but essentially the idea is that, well, it's conceivable that someone could have some kind of conscious belief that rapists should not be rewarded by the law enforcing their successful reproduction from their illegal acts, that in some sense the law is essentially abetting a kind of illegal interest, although that legal interest is being endorsed through the vehicle of the protection of a new life. But again, I still think that generally relies on this general grey area, which is also hard to countenance, which is essentially that the state is, in some sense, this is almost like the state is chasing after the citizens, the members of its society, almost like a nanny trying to enforce some kind of moral propriety, and in so doing creating such an insidious form of subversive control that the general harm to the liberal cultural structure becomes something that is less a cultural living ethos and more of a kind of a traditional prescription. And I think that in some sense that tends societies towards not thinking and holding their principles and morality and standards in any proper regard, because it doesn't in some sense need to be discussed, because it's a function of the power structure or something like that. It turns morality into a sociological anyway, I think that this is a point that I didn't raise in my abortion, although thematically I did raise it, which is essentially, be very careful that you don't turn into essentially the same kind of identity politics totalitarian, or at least in my breakdown of what it is that they actually are, which is essentially a program of sociological control that doesn't know how to solve a problem, but can essentially work out how to dispense or deploy a project of controlling an issue instead of being able to actually solve the problem of that issue. And so because you're dealing with the issue of control, you can think that you're actually solving a problem, but in some sense you're just controlling for it, and that comes at a general cost, which sort of because it's done in a fundamentally unprincipled way, or an unthinking way, or in an automatic way, you end up creating a kind of a horrible subversion in which society is not functioning transparently. It's functioning, let's say, obtusely, and in some sense, this is, I mean, I know what I sound like to some people. I know that I sound like, oh, you're trying to be so sophisticated, you're trying to be so delicate in these matters of morality and ethics. But what you end up doing is you end up, sort of creating space for a kind of a decrepit culture of decadence and abuse or something like that. And I think that is fundamentally necessary to have a structure that is capable of sustaining its integrity and principle. Is that and in some sense this is the modern corruption of the state by kind of usually the leftist sort of thing, but I think that it is reflected in the moral authoritarian of the so-called conservative traditional sort of base, that these are this is the same problem in two different manifestations or permutations of it, which is that I mean, I guess you could call it paternalism, or infantilism. But the idea is that I think that there are ills and there are problems in society which are reflections of real problems, but the real problems don't exist in society, they exist in individuals. And therefore, trying to treat the symptom and not the cause is essentially ends up becoming a self-defeating sort of Ponzi scheme that spirals into a kind of authoritarian abyss. And although the moral authoritarianism of the traditional conservative, sort of, let's say, Christian values that they want ensconced in the law, I do think that you do have to say, I personally have these views, and they are fundamentally, my true beliefs about the right to life of the unborn child, but that because of bootstrapping liberal principles in some kind of institutional framework, so that we can say that we live in a secular society where people need to be responsible for their choices and decisions and things like that. Like, you need that clear water. You need that space in order to have a society that's capable of even being honest about its own condition. And replacing that reservoir of libertarian consciousness with, let's say, problem solving and using control instead of actually solving a real problem, because it can't be solved on the level of control. It has to be solved in a more direct fashion. I think that we do have to have institutional safeguards, essentially, that bootstrap and preserve classical liberal values. And in some sense, that means that you do have to make horrible trade-offs between rights at some points. And I think that is serviced by having a window of legal abortion, because it's morally controversial in a technical sense. And that is the space for culture to fulfill the role of developing its own moral standards, and for people to see the reflection of their own style of morality and constitution of their. And like, I know that, well, can't you do that with the other issues, because the right to life is just such an important right? Can't you do that with libertine drug laws? And this is also why I am for decriminalizing drugs, and in fact legalizing them, so that you can get rid of organized crime. And you can say, well, if people, because then the culture can say, well, yeah, they're very bad people. Well, in some sense, you might actually, if by legalizing drugs and by making them very cheap and refined and manufactured, perhaps in a better way, reducing the profit margins, because it's no longer a legal an illegal illicit trade that criminals can make money from. If you legalize the whole thing, you might be able to essentially make it so that only curious adults indulge in it, because there's no more profit incentive to push it onto children, and the culture itself can mature and develop and sort of say, well, yeah, if you want to do that, you can do that, but it's not advised. It's a dark path. That is the culture that is actually capable of conserving itself, in terms of its integrity and its principles. And in some sense, I think that would even lead to better outcomes in terms of law enforcement, in terms of criminal justice, in terms of putting the right onus on the right in the right societal institutions. Because right now the state is subverting morality and let's say the role of culture itself in being the generator of the mores of society. We should not be a state-led society. We should be a libertarian culture-led society. And I think that the abortion thing and the drug thing are both wonderful ways in which you can institutionalize. You can say, yes, I'm personally against these things, but the practice of the institution of the state has to have certain allowances, because that is, and then you've got a cultural legal gesture that essentially allows for the cultural institutionalization of self-determinism, and a culture of life and a culture of responsibility and self-determinism. So that, I think, when we finally have that kind of political maturity, then we can focus on public good. Then we can focus on, okay, well, what programs can actually be done by the state that actually might help people, or how can it get out of the way, or what is there a democratic consensus towards trying to create new public goods, because maybe organized government can make certain advances and help people and create consortiums or create platforms for stakeholders to coordinate better or something like that. I think the state can be a hub of coordination that can help to, in some sense, assist private entities and individuals, or something like that. I mean, I think that there is a scope for inventing public goods, but that is an optional extra, and that it's not the same. It's sort of, it has to work within a kind of framework in which, because you see, I think you have to be very strict against the state about what it is allowed to criminalize. But the state can be as creative and innovative and as it wants in trying to create structures that are, let's say, positive mechanisms. It can try experiment in that sort of way. But quite frankly, when you mix experimentation with coercive, compulsive structures and regulations, you've got a different flavor of and in some sense, I think that you should have robust constitutions which individuals can use to litigate against a state that tries to create mechanisms which aren't designed to be complementary or optional. All government programs should be opt-in. You should choose to engage with them. They shouldn't be compulsive, essentially. And if you even designed government programs in that way, you would probably have a much more sustainable model, and also have a much better way of accounting for if it is actually even producing a public good and not some kind of moral hazard and some kind of dependence and, sort of generalized, inculcated, sort of destruction, etc., etc. Anyway, and I do think that essentially private charity can do these things a lot better, which is essentially what I even imagine as if you do want to overcome capitalism, essentially I think that you should pool together and make, you shouldn't do it through the government, you shouldn't do it through the state, you should do it through your freedom of association. You should work out how to contract and develop it as a project in the private sphere. There's nothing stopping you from doing so. And if the state were actually in a better position of trying, because essentially it's always trying to do things that it's not competent to do, and because of it's got this weird kind of authoritarian flavor inside of it, or the stripe inside of it, that it just keeps on having to double down on its own unsustainable sort of control, sociological, moral blackmail and hostage taking. Anyway, but I do think that, and obviously you could always say that, oh, well, they're corrupt elites that are part of a cabal that are using the state to enshrine protections for entrenched interests and, sort of oligarchs and big things, all those sorts of things. Well, that might be so. But how you fix that is you fix the culture first. You fix the political culture first. You fix the moral structure. And people don't want that, or they don't, or that you could perhaps say, well, they are fooled by the mainstream media, and they are sold other moral bromides, and they're sold quackery and sort of armchair moral indignation, and which just is more doubling down in this program of never ending, sort of putting out fires that they are themselves creating, moral hazards and dependencies and spiraling debts, and the state, is not even capable of funding its own liabilities. And, well, how you fix that first is that you don't try to tackle that spider web and mess. You at least have to have a kind of moral consensus. You have to have some kind of some basic model that actually is capable of, in principle, being an alternative to the current spiderweb mess. And until we have that as, let's say, the true north, as the compass to take us out of the mess, it's you're always having people dabble in this never-ending shit show and a recycled moral panic and outrage and because it just doesn't come from a place of first principles. It doesn't come from a place that actually has a legal structure that enshrines the integrity of the secular citizen as the basic structure, as the basic liberal order that actually can even be worth conserving, and that actually gives dignity to the individual and the individual moral paradigm, and which is, without that there is no culture. There's just, or at least there's only a society. There's only a kind of a society, I would argue, with some kind of layers of slave morality, confusing and disorientating, a kind of a horrible game of dominion and legions of infighting and things like that. And I'll just say that there is an endorsement in Christianity for a secular distinction. Obviously, the famous render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And in some sense, I think that Jesus might have been revolutionary. I mean, he was certainly spiritually revolutionary, but he wasn't he wasn't a secular revolutionary. And perhaps he would have been politically revolutionary if there were other forms of political, moral. I mean, in some sense, they did break the Roman law, actually. So when he says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, that did not essentially include freedom of association, because it was against the Roman law to have a freedom of association. So they did actually break the Roman law with a kind of principle. So, there's a spiritual principle there or something like that. Anyway, you can kind of see the point that I'm drawing up, but I'm saying that essentially we do need a secular institutional structure in order just to protect the realm of morality properly. And in some sense, if there are problems in Islam, it has to do with, this is kind of the crux of that kind of issue. But in some sense, I don't think that necessarily has to be a problem with all of Islam, but or every version of Islam. But it's even problematic to talk in such a way that's even very offensive to some people, and essentially might even be called blasphemy, and it might, so. And that's fundamentally problematic. If people want to have a legal system that is sympathetic to those sorts of things, then essentially, I would argue that. Anyway, that's the same kind of threat that is being posed by the identity politics, sociological planning, and identity sort of totalitarian. Anyway, I don't want to split off into too many issues, but I think I've talked about everything. Yeah, that sort of covers that whole topic.